Okay, let's get started. Welcome to our webinar. I'm David Teeple, Director of Client Services for SEDLAC, and I will be your host for today's session. This is the second virtual event of 2024, the first being decoding the value of ChatGPT and large language models for supply chain. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on our website. Today, we are presenting supply chain cybersecurity for material handling and logistics systems. We encourage you to participate in today's session by utilizing the chat window to post your comments and questions to share with our speaker and the audience. Note that we may wait until the end of the presentation to answer questions. These days, we are all concerned about labor to run our business. Attracting and retaining talent is critical to us as supply chain professionals. However, labor is a diminishing resource. Because of that, focus in the supply chain has shifted to incorporating technology like automation tools, AI, and robotics. Because of this, we have increased our digital risk. Cyber attacks are becoming big business for criminals. $51 million ransom at Johnson Controls, $100 million ransom at MGM, and an attack on Estes, which cost an estimated $12 million per day, just to name a few. Cybersecurity has become a focal point beyond the information security community. Material handling, retail, and supply chain logistics professionals have an added challenge of addressing cyber physical systems risk. Enterprises who seek to stay ahead of existing and emerging threats are looking to holistically address their risk across all levels of the organization. I would like to introduce our speaker for today's event, Brian Van Vleet of Rockwell Automation, who will cover the specific threat owners face, specific mitigation techniques, and use case successes from leaders in this space. Whether you're in IT or in operations, this session is intended to highlight the need for a unified cybersecurity approach. Brian Van Vleet has been involved in industrial control systems and cybersecurity services since joining Rockwell in 2014. He currently serves as a commercial lead for Rockwell's Connected Services division, representing project delivery and remote support engineers globally. Brian has a passion for supporting clients and industry stakeholders on their industrial networking and cybersecurity journeys, leveraging a risk-based approach. Brian, welcome to our session today.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, SEDLAC team, for having me. I'm really excited that we get to talk about this topic today. One that gets thrown out a lot, but maybe oftentimes we don't get to spend enough time on it, given all the other priorities that the industry deals with day in and day out. So really excited to use this time here. We've got about the next hour to talk through a wide range of topics. And cybersecurity is very broad. My goal, my intent here today is that, whoever you are, wherever you are in your organization and in your career, whether you have direct responsibility for a security program, and this ties directly into what you do, or you've never even heard some of these concepts, you were just maybe interested in the topic. My goal here is that everyone walks away with something, and that there's something for everyone here. And so that's what we'll talk through today, from entry level through some specifics that you can walk away with. A couple quick notes. This is informational at a high level, and it's not meant, of course, to be an exhaustive training in just 1 hour here. But that's to say, if there is terminology or an acronym that I throw out there, please don't hesitate to chat anytime and stop me. I'm happy to clarify on the spot. There are plenty of acronyms in this space, just like in any others as well. And I'll give you your first one here, FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I will do my best here to help you sort through what we see as an overabundance of fear in the industry of you need to do this because you are liable for such and such, and there is merit to that. But again, getting to fact and getting to tangible action is really what we're after here. Okay. So with that said, this will be the flow of again, the next roughly 60 minutes or so, with questions at the end. I'll provide, for those of you who don't know who Rockwell is, or maybe just from a cursory standpoint, I'll just provide a quick overview of who we are, what my organization does, in just a few minutes or less. So we won't dwell on this because I really want to jump into this next piece, which is industry insights. That's what are we hearing in the industry? What are the challenges that leaders in the industry, be it end users or OEMs or integrators, consulting firms, whatever it might be, what challenges are they wrestling with, and what are they either doing or not doing about it? That'll be a big piece of this. And then we'll spend the balance of the time talking about those practical strategies. We'll talk about frameworks and why those are important to follow and to align to, at least in part. And then again, if you're a security practitioner or you want to pass this along to a security practitioner, there will be plenty of recommendations as well that we'll go through at a high level to help you, start to think about what you might be able to do to increase your cyber preparedness. So let's just jump right in. Who is Rockwell? For those who don't know, or maybe only briefly know us, the quick answer is we are the world's largest company that is solely dedicated to industrial automation. And we really hang our cap on the fact that we've been doing this for over a century. Now, why is that important? Because everything I talk about today will refer to industrial environments or OT environments. Like I said, cybersecurity is a very broad topic, and I want to reiterate that everything I mentioned, the best practices, recommendations, and use cases, I mentioned them all, and they'll have broader implications, but I mentioned them all in the light of operational technology. Those systems and facilities, machines, the hardware and software that run our productions or our warehouses or whatever it might be, everything down to the smallest sensor. We are really concerned with those components that optimize an operation's throughput, ensure its quality, or physically move a product from A to B for an end user. All of that is what we're talking about securing today. And there's excellent cybersecurity principles that can be taken from this to a broader enterprise security standpoint. But again, we're going to focus on this technology because that's where we live and breathe as Rockwell Automation. So a few more terms, you might hear me call it industrial control systems, ICS, or operational technology, OT. Some in the industry call it cyber physical systems, CPS. Those are all interchangeable terms. But we don't, as Rockwell, just make these products. As you can see in the upper right-hand corner here, we also have roughly a quarter of our business dedicated to servicing our customer environments as well, and helping them get the most out of the technology that Rockwell brings to bear. So that's all great, but why is a 100-plus-year-old company who specializes in industrial automation and services talking to me about cybersecurity? Well, to answer that, we really need to talk about digital transformation. And digital transformation, as I'm sure the whole entire audience is aware, has been just a booming concept in the last decade plus. It is the process of connecting assets and systems to leverage the inherent data that resides in those systems to do things like make process improvements, provide additional transparency into your consumer base or supply chain, and overall make better decisions. And at Rockwell, we've been instrumental in driving digital transformation, both in and around industrial control systems. In fact, these actually here on the screen are the capabilities that we bring to bear. Everything from warehouse management and automation, autonomous mobile robots, AMRs, virtual simulation and emulation software, again, for process improvements, and the list goes on. But I mention this because all of this requires interconnected systems, which creates what we call in the security space an ever-expanding attack surface. That is a broadened footprint where you are left potentially exposed to a cyber threat. Okay. And on the right side here, it's worth mentioning that we as Rockwell, as a company, we don't exist in a vacuum to service clients in this space. We have a very large partner ecosystem, whether it's around the topic of digital transformation or cybersecurity. We work with OEMs, integrators, security providers, technology providers, day in and day out. And all of this is ultimately to service, again, those end users who are using the technology, who are moving the equipment, who are making products, whatever it might be. Okay. So now that our stage is set, let's get to the topic at hand and really the issue at hand. We'll focus in really on supply chain and logistics organizations here. And as an organization in this space, you face challenges day in, day out that extend far beyond cybersecurity. And we know it. These images here are generated from our discussions with industry leaders. These are the common themes that we hear over and over and over again. We can't keep enough heads on our staff. Dave mentioned that at the beginning. I'm being stretched too thin. I've got to offer more flexibility. I have to compete with shorter turnaround times. And if all of that in itself isn't enough, yes, I'm facing new and growing threats to my business continuity, be it natural disasters or be it cyber disasters. So taking these first three buckets, we'll save those for another conversation, but it's worth mentioning them because they are truly the primary drivers for why we see organizations moving towards digital transformation. My question for owners and operators in this space is really, are you pursuing secure digital transformation? Or in other words, are you building out that understanding of your attack surface and what mitigations you need to deploy or you choose not to deploy as you go? So a great example I want to share is actually industrial safety, because we've been here before. We saw this same dilemma 20, 30 years ago where industrial safety and environments was an afterthought. We built systems and the entire goal was to get up and running as quickly as possible, to pump out product, to move product, whatever it might be. And in a lot of cases, we didn't consider the dangers that this equipment or whatever it might be presented until incidents happened. Cybersecurity is in the exact same place today. We're just only truly starting to see the impact of these legacy and unprotected systems really in the last 5 to 10 years here. It's just coming to light. And so we have a long journey ahead of us to remediate a lot of legacy understanding and legacy approaches, but also continue to adjust to the threats of tomorrow that will greatly differ, in years to come versus today. So my final point here is that, digital transformation in itself is not the problem. I would say the opposite. I'd go so far as to say digital transformation is a business requirement now. However, if you ignore the risks that are presented with it and associated with connecting all of our systems and putting internet-enabled devices into a controlled environment, without considering those implications of how to protect them, really we're taking a gamble that at some point in time, probability says we will not win. So as we continue today, I just want you to keep those two themes in mind, which is designing in security and taking a risk-based approach as we go about digital transformation. So this is the fun part. Let's take a look at an actual example. In this case, let's look at a modern connected warehouse. More and more, we're hearing this term lights out operations, which means fully autonomous warehouses that basically can react in near real time to either customer or industry demands. And the benefits of this are clearly evident, right? Quicker reaction means quicker customer turnaround, and better adaptability to market constraints, say a global chip shortage, right? It also lowers your costs and can reduce waste. So again, it is a business imperative to make you competitive overall. But I do want to consider, again, the risks that overlay to a process such as this. So take inbound orders. You've got your ordering system, supplier data, production planning, and all of that work orders data being tied to your ERP. Now, in a lot of cases, we are integrating that ERP to a manufacturing execution system, MES, that is fulfilling work orders and tying those work orders into, in this case, maybe even a warehouse management or warehouse execution system. And that's sending instructions down to these control systems to say, move boxes here, resort, pallets there, whatever it might be. All of that exists to send data into the plant environment or the warehouse environment to react in better timing. But we don't just nowadays send data and instructions into the warehouse environment. We're also serving data out of the warehouse environment, taking, like I said, connected assets, internet-enabled assets like IoT, Internet of Things, gathering much more data from our endpoints than we ever did before. Things like handheld scanners and robotics and vision systems, machine sensors, and the list goes on. We're taking all of that data and we're serving it up back into the enterprise for better decision making, analytics and dashboarding and reporting, and so on. Again, that's where we get the real advantage of digital transformation. So all of that creates a very interconnected ecosystem where data is coming down, data is going up, data is moving laterally as well, all throughout these systems. Now let's look at this potentially from an attacker's point of view. There are 4 common, what we call attack vectors, that are most prevalent in OT supply chain attacks. The first, and still to this day, most common entry point into an OT system is via the enterprise, right? So something like a phishing attack where somebody in the enterprise, potentially not even remotely tied to a controls network, selects a malicious link. We know it happens day in, day out. They can't all be prevented. And that infection can then move laterally. If an attacker is knowledgeable enough and has the right desire to get to these systems, they can move laterally throughout your system. And if you're not properly architected between plant or warehouse and enterprise systems, they can penetrate the OT environment. And this is where all the revenue comes from. So this is the ultimate goal for attackers. The second attack vector would be a direct attack on the OT network itself. So in this case, think about maybe a compromised removable media device like a USB that gets directly inserted into equipment on the warehouse floor, right? And therefore, it bypasses any of the enterprise security controls that we would have in place to prevent this. We've seen this a lot as well. Again, we build such strong walls in our enterprise to prevent outside attackers. We sometimes forget about the back door that is a direct plug into the network. And then the third vector here, and this has probably gotten the most attention in recent years, this would be an indirect attack on your OT network via some sort of third party, or we call these supply chain attacks, right? Most often this is unintentional as well. Every single OT environment, warehouses and logistics, certainly no exception, makes use of both remote employees and third-party technology. And if we allow these connections on a day in, day out basis without monitoring what is happening over those connections, who is using it, what actions are they taking, we can be potentially overlooking a significant amount of risk to our organization. Again, the revenue generating portion of our organization. And this can be some of the most complex attack vectors to address because it can be so proliferated in all of these different connections into our environment. Great examples is a building management system, right? They are increasingly becoming interconnected, again, to serve data back to equipment providers on how your utilities performance is doing, how you can optimize those utilities. Well, like we saw actually over 10 years ago now, the Target attack, Target's enterprise systems were impacted because a technician working on an HVAC system accidentally inserted a virus into that environment. So it's definitely real. And then the final attack vector would be the threat of an insider. We can never truly rule this out. And so we do need to be cognizant of what insider threats can present. And more often than not, these are also unintentional actions, right? Just someone with legitimate access making a configuration change or something in our network which causes impact and harm. But when we get later in this discussion to some detection technologies, this will be really key because this helps you identify in real time if we need to roll back some sort of action that's been taken, again, even for legitimate purposes. Okay. So if we take those trends that supply chain logistics companies face on a day in, day out basis, and we overlay these trends, which is what we see all OT organizations facing from a security standpoint in their industrial environments, we get some of these issues here, which is number one, like I mentioned, our environments are becoming increasingly interconnected and that attack surface is growing at really an exponential pace year over year. Number two, we're still in large part, even if you have a greenfield, we're still in large part dealing with technology that in the first place never conceived of cybersecurity in its development. So inherently, security was not designed in. A lot of equipment in the space, even especially IoT nowadays, is really created to serve data first and make it available first and foremost. And security can be an afterthought. Third, it's getting easier and easier, as we just walked through, for attackers to penetrate these environments. A lot of times they're doing it with what's called off-the-shelf technology now. Ransomware as a service has become a topic that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. And these tool sets are being developed to quickly allow attackers to get access, hold your process for ransom, and extort you. And then finally, there's this, again, common theme of a labor shortage. There's a skill shortage in general in industrial environments. We know that. It's hard enough to keep labor and staff to man these autonomous systems in their own right, and those systems are getting more advanced. Well, at the same time, there's a massive shortage of cyber professionals out there. There's something I saw the other day, about 5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs in general. So if you have both of these gaps, it obviously stands to reason that there's a massive shortage of people who know industrial OT cybersecurity. We can't keep enough people in the industry quick enough to keep up with the threat and the demand. So just to summarize all this, more connectivity and less secure devices paired with more actors who are more motivated to get after these environments and less people to deal with the threat itself, it creates this perfect storm that we face. And again, it comes back to being prepared, walking through some systematic reviews of what is in place, and we'll talk about that in order to not be left behind per se. Okay. Now, maybe you don't see that your organization faces any unique set of risks or threats to your operations. I just do X or I just do Y. I've heard of a lot of that as well, right? I'm not critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure has obviously been worried about this for much, much longer. But I would contend that, and I would say, anyone with an industrial footprint and interconnected devices is a target, right? And what I see is that the greatest problems come to those who devote little to no attention to their operational risk, and they focus all cyber attention on the enterprise. And I just want to share a few of these numbers and see with you if you agree. In the last 3 years alone, industrial manufacturing and distribution became the highest targeted sector and has remained so since, by the way. And according to research from SANS, that's an institute, a third-party institute, out of 4,800 recordable incidents in about a 2.5 to 3 year span, nearly a quarter of those cyber incidents impacted industrial organizations. By the way, half of all of those attacks were targeted on the US. So there's a massive focus on US organizations. It's really no surprise to hear that industrials, on average, pay the highest ransom. That's why they're getting more and more focus year over year. The latest figure I saw was that over $2 million per incident is the average ransom paid by an industrial organization. And then you compound this with the fact that this metric that we track in the industry called breakout time, that's basically the time it takes for an attacker to make initial penetration and move laterally to their target. It's decreased year over year. Whereas 2 years ago, it was about 75 minutes on average. It's about 60 minutes now. And that varies greatly depending upon what the target asset is, if it's on the enterprise side or OT side. It's going to be longer on the OT side, but it shows a trend that attackers, again, are getting better. And we've seen even as short as 20 minutes in some recent examples. That is why we've seen the rise of OT-specific malware sets and these groups that have come up that target only industrial organizations. Because at the end of the day, the opportunity cost for a criminal organization to target an industrial environment, it's very low. It's a low barrier to entry, but the profitability is potentially so high if we are not prepared. And that's what we want to be, is prepared. And the final point here is just we don't need to look far. We don't even need to look beyond this industry to find recent examples. In August, Seattle Tacoma Airport dealt with a cyber attack that caused network disruptions for over 3 days. You might remember it. It caused delays. It caused canceled flights. It impacted their baggage handling systems. So those are OT systems. In 2022, Expeditors International shut down their operations after they had a global cyber attack. Same thing in December of 21 with Hellman Worldwide Logistics. And then quite possibly one of the most famous cyber incidents in history was NotPetya, Maersk being a large shipping organization globally, and 80 other companies. They were infected with this malware called NotPetya. It brought their operations to a halt. It brought tons of other operations to a halt, and it caused billions of dollars of damages. This is what we exist really to prevent in large, wide scale, is these types of days. So that's the doom and gloom, right? That's the how did we get here? What do we reside? What kind of state do we reside in today? But there is a path forward. There are steps to be taken where you can feel confident in your security strategy and have a plan to continue improving, just like safety, like I mentioned. Um, Personally, the most common gap that I see when I talk to clients about their OT security programs is a lack of interaction between their IT and their OT teams. We still see it to this day. We need to get these two sides of the house working together if we want to make any meaningful progress around security maturity. And I see it all the time, right? Comments from the OT side of the house. Well, that's IT's responsibility, and they make sure we don't get attacked. Or from IT side of the house, I put a firewall in place. The engineers, the operators, they know how to protect their equipment. Or even more so, competing priorities, right? IT locks everything down. They don't let me into anything. Or OT doesn't let me get into their systems. And at the end of the day, there's good reason for both. It's actually the principle of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Historically, IT, first and foremost, is concerned with the confidentiality and integrity of data in our environment. And OT is oftentimes only concerned with availability. Again, how much uptime can I get out of my systems? How can I get up and running as quickly as possible? But we have to marry up these interests to find common ground and to make real significant progress and to get the most out of our digital transformation. A really great example is patch management, and we'll talk about it more later. But this is where the two sides of the house oftentimes don't see eye to eye because IT can keep systems patched very quickly. I mean, we have the concept of Patch Tuesday, right? Where basically on a weekly basis you can keep systems patched. But in the OT environment, we're lucky if we can patch once, twice a year at times. On average, I see strong patch management programs doing something like quarterly patching. But again, if we're not seeing eye to eye and having clear communication on what assets we're patching and when and why, we're going to continue to have this divide that will set our security program back. And the best way to get these two sides of the house to collaborate is through a detailed planning process that establishes an OT security roadmap. Now, an OT roadmap outlines a proactive, holistic security program. It can exist exclusive of the enterprise security plan, or in what is our recommended approach, it should be integrated with the enterprise security plan. The one requirement is that you absolutely take OT's specific needs into an account. A roadmap is not only essential to ensuring business continuity and role requirements, but it's really the foundation for setting up your security funding and determining how you're going to maximize the return on your security investment. And let's be honest, nobody wants to spend on security, right? I'll be the first to say it is a cost center. But if I don't have locks on my house and security cameras around my office, I could be leaving myself exposed to unnecessary risk. And it's the same concept here. right? So I bring this up because if you haven't taken this step as an organization, these are some great steps to follow in this process. One, create organizational alignment, IT/OT workshops, and leadership engagement, picking a framework that we'll talk about here in just a second. Those are all great initial steps. And then once you have that alignment, conducting assessments and business impact analysis, baselining yourself on where you stand today and where you want to be. And then taking that outcome and again, determining your security funding model and how much are we going to allocate and what is the return on my security posture if I spend in that space. Doing all of this in a single instance is great. And again, IT/OT workshops, we've led a number of these that are very, very productive and beneficial. But really, this needs to be a yearly review, an annual review to truly get progress out of this.
Hey, Brian, could you talk a little bit more about that workshop?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So an IT/OT workshop is exactly how it sounds. It brings the enterprise leaders into a room at the same time as the OT operation side of the house. This is actually something that Rockwell, we did ourselves in about the 2015 timeframe. So for those who don't know, and I shared it earlier, Rockwell is a manufacturer in ourselves. We have about 16 production locations. We have a significant OT footprint. But we recognized at the time, our CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, recognized that we had two separate plans. IT had their plan and OT had their plan. If in the event of a catastrophic incident, neither side knew what each other were doing. We just didn't. We weren't having that communication. We didn't know what to do. And so we started this concept of an IT/OT workshop where we came together, we shared what different, what the same concept, but potentially different outcomes meant to each side of the house. Asset management and inventory is a great example. IT thought they had one understanding of asset inventory in the OT environment, and OT shared a completely different side of the story. But that's something that it's a best practice we still share into the industry today, is helping to mediate these IT/OT workshops, because again, Rockwell comes from a very unique space where we live and breathe in OT environments. And we obviously have significant capabilities and expertise in enterprise security. So it's marrying those two sides. Thanks for the question. We'll transition now to frameworks. And one of the most common questions I get is, am I doing enough in my program? Or even more simply, if I'm not doing anything, where do I even start? And what you see on the screen here is just a sampling of the many publications and frameworks that exist out there. There are dozens more, I promise you. But whatever you choose to select, it is a starting point for your roadmap. Now, it's worth mentioning that most of them are based upon one another and they share significant similarities to one another. So which one you end up choosing ultimately depends on the level of familiarity within your organization, typically knowledge, a lot of cases what you're already aligned to from an enterprise security perspective. But again, we want to put an OT lens on our security program. So I'll just call out a few here. And again, maybe you're aligned to these already. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing about them. But possibly the most commonly referenced standard we would see out there today, especially for early security programs, is NIST 882 R3. NIST stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is an agnostic, independent entity that develops standards far beyond just cybersecurity, but they have some excellent cybersecurity documentation. And again, 882 R3 is most commonly referenced for OT environments. For those looking to go a little bit deeper and even certify some of their processes and systems against the standard, IEC 62443 is a great one. Actually, Rockwell has certified against a number of our production lines against 62443 standards. And then actually, I really like this Department of Defense issuance, DODI, that's called the Risk Management Framework. And again, it's not specific to industrial environments, but it helps conceptually set up the process for taking a risk-based approach and walking that risk-based model. So again, there's a number here of standards to follow here. Whichever one you choose, I'm sure we'll have similarities with all the rest, but it is crucial to select a framework. Just double clicking on the two of them, the DoDI and NIST. This is what DoDI looks like. It is the basis for the assess, design, implement, evaluate, and optimize methodology. And so in a minute, actually, we'll talk about this concept of governance. But this is a framework where if you're a small organization and you haven't stood up a robust security team or practice, and following the laundry list of items that might come from some of these other frameworks might seem daunting, taking a framework like this will help you stand up a practice, right? And help you put in some of those early processes to, again, start to create that risk management framework or security roadmap. But I'll focus a little bit more here on, again, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. They've got what's called the Cybersecurity Framework, or NIST CSF, as it's commonly referred to. And again, this is a broad standard. This applies to enterprise security as it does OT security. But it in large part is a starting point that serves as that fundamental basis, and in a lot of ways a checklist to make sure you're covering all your bases, right? So it's looked at as a journey, as a continuum without a start and a stop, that gets tweaked as you go, a lot like a digital transformation journey. It mirrors that. And it's traditionally had these 5 key pillars that you see here on the screen: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And actually just last year, they updated it to a version 2 and added a 6th pillar, which is governance. Ultimately, we distill this down even more simply to before, during, after. What are you doing to prevent a cyber attack or respond to a cyber attack? Okay. And so we'll walk through these in our detailed recommendations, but it is important to, if you're aligning to the NIST CSF, it's important to recognize that it's not meant to be a linear model where you start at point A and end at point Z, moving sequentially through each. Instead, it's intended to serve as a basis for creating a strategy and how to plan for improvement in each area, oftentimes in parallel, because there is so much to consider. Okay. Ultimately, whatever standard you end up selecting or have selected, they're all pointing towards the same thing, which is a defense in depth approach, which quite simply means the more layers of protection that you put into place, the more difficult of a target you become to an attacker. And the slower a threat might impact you, which gives you critical time to react. This is a simple model as well. You basically walk the chain of data and information flow from your endpoints and your IoT devices through to your applications, server switches, all of that stack. And then in this model as well, you're also considering your physical security and your governance policies and procedures. And I'll make one last quick note here on regulations, that today, unless you are a critical infrastructure labeled organization, in the US, there are not sweeping regulations which require foundational cybersecurity principles. SEC, it's called SEC Rule 206, was enacted late last year, and that will be the closest comparison to a regulation that we have in the US today, because it requires publicly traded corporations to both report on a risk management strategy, a roadmap like we're talking about, as well as reporting on cyber incidents within a time frame of 4 days. But without sweeping regulation in place, it really puts the onus on the owner operator, the end user, to ensure that they have a mature cyber practice, right? We're seeing other areas like Europe start to mandate this as a requirement, but still in the US, it's up to you. And this is important because as you look to shore up your own security program and you look beyond your own 4 walls into your supply chain and the third parties that you work with, you're also beholden to hold them to a certain level of security to keep you secure. So just keep that in mind. If for those waiting for regulation to catch up, again, the stats and probabilities show that you're more than likely to experience an attack anytime before regulation and financial motivation from that sense comes down the pike. Okay. Let's talk about some detailed recommendations. Again, we'll keep this at relatively high level here, but just those things that you can consider when either starting and setting up a program or expanding a current program that's in place. So getting back to the NIST framework, as I mentioned, they have a number of publications, and you can follow any number of those to get a checklist of to-dos, and get very granular in your actions in your OT cyberspace. But if you haven't poured through all of the documentation or you don't have time to, the easiest way to make sense of it all is actually with 3 strategies that they outline. They're called risk-informed, repeatable, and adaptive. In a lot of ways, you can consider these progress of cyber maturity and readiness, but that's not to say that they're all fixed buckets. They are just they're guidelines again, and they help you start to track where you stand in your cyber maturity and your readiness. So we'll walk through each, and we'll pull out a few key security controls from each, and then we'll get to some questions here at the end. So let's start with the first one here. Risk informed. This is all about finding out what I don't know today. And organizations taking this approach are most commonly early in their journey, either in general with security or specific to an OT journey. The actions that are involved in taking this strategy include conducting an asset inventory evaluation. This is almost always the starting point, or a risk assessment or network evaluation, or the less formal IT/OT workshop, like I mentioned, where you bring everyone to the table. And what you're looking for is addressing what exists today. What are my security policies and procedures that I do have? Asking that question: if I show up to my warehouse and I've got blue screens all around, who's the first person I'm calling? What am I doing? Do we grant broad access into our systems, or are we strictly controlling who has access to what? Ultimately, this is geared towards generating a baseline understanding of what's in place and taking that information to make a business case for further investment into security, technology, tooling, processes, people, and so on. This serves as the foundation for that roadmap. And one of those foundational practices, again, is this piece of governance. This is standing up the scaffolding, so to speak, around your security program. I often get asked, how do I create a governance model? Do we need to have a separate OT governance model from IT? And I like NIST's updated guidance around this, and I'll paraphrase this here, but it's the establishment of a strategy and supply chain risk management, roles and responsibilities, policies, procedures, processes, and oversight of the strategy, which I really interpret as: do you have a documented plan? Are all parties that need to be engaged actively engaged, including your third parties, your providers? And do you have reporting structures and an oversight committee? So really, whether you create a separate OT governance program or you've got it all combined with the enterprise program, which is probably the best practice that we would suggest, you just want to make sure that, again, you're accounting for OT in your governance model and not leaving it out. I also get asked early in programs, what's the best way to quantify risk? And to what level of detail do I need to go to assess my environments? The reason being, there are many different types of risk assessments that you can perform, and not all are alike. You can do them with third parties, you can do them internally. You can do simple and quick assessments in the form of what's called a vulnerability discovery survey, which is basically cross-referencing assets that you have in your system to a public database, the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, publicly lists vulnerabilities in controls equipment or all technology, and then taking that to spread awareness to the rest of the organization about: here's how prevalent my vulnerabilities are, or here's how much exposure we have. We knew we had it, we just didn't know to what level. And that helps to generate buy-in. Quick disclaimer: if you're going to run something like a vulnerability scan, it has to be done with OT-centric tools. I tell IT often, as IT, you won't find a quicker way of getting kicked out of a plant or facility or warehouse or anything else than running a network scan with traditional IT tools. that more often than not take down control systems, PLCs, and the like. And so be very careful, when you are running a vulnerability scan, that you're doing it properly. But on the other hand, for those looking to get a more comprehensive view of your risk, comprehensive risk assessments are great options that not only map assets and vulnerabilities, but they also take into account what are those policies and procedures that we have to react today. Maybe what countermeasures have I put into place that need to factor into my risk scoring. And so my score at the end of the day is not just the number of vulnerabilities that exist in my assets, but it does take into account the fact that I have segmentation or some of these other strategies that we'll talk about. At the end of the day, when you're risk assessing, whichever one you choose really comes down to what you know about your environment today and the level of investment that you're ready to make. Not all organizations are ready to fund a security program from day one. They need to generate that buy-in. And so that's where no matter what risk assessment you choose, it becomes a great tool of championing security within your organization. Moving on from risk informed into repeatable, this is really about taking specific action to shore up security risk and making strategic investments in your security. Again, nobody likes to spend on security, but we have to if we want to not leave ourselves exposed to significant risk. And so we want to aim our priorities at mitigating the highest priority risk, not just any risk in general. So we'll talk about a few of these: segmentation, third-party remote access, endpoint monitoring, backups and recovery planning. Whatever order you take to tackle these initiatives, at the end of the day, thinking back to defense in depth, you want to start layering in these defenses to improve your overall security posture and not look for a silver bullet, so to speak. That's how you dramatically reduce the potential impact that a cyber event can have upon you. So let's take a few moments here to walk through these. There's a lot in this category and bucket. We will keep it high level, starting with the concept of modernizing some of these legacy assets that exist out there, and getting back to this concept of designing in security, not just putting a band-aid over what exists today. So we've been talking for 40 or so minutes here today about OT, right? But what actually is OT? Turns out there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be implemented and maintained to support the data requirements of digital transformation. And these are just some examples here. Redundant sets of servers for your plant applications and supervisory control, firewalls for your segmentation, core distribution and access switching for lower level segmentation, and each of these vary in size and functionality, and operator workstations that can potentially run individual operating workstations all across a warehouse or facility. And it's important to note that not all facilities operate with this level of infrastructure. And in a lot of cases, if you don't have a stratified model of switching, for example, you're potentially leaving yourself more exposed to cyber threats if you have a very flat network, for example. But if you do have this level of infrastructure, you likely struggle to keep it up to date, keep it patched, keep it monitored in real time for its health and its status. So this, in my opinion, this gets back to governance. And oftentimes it's undefined who even owns these assets, right? In a lot of ways, these servers, firewalls, and switches resemble the IT stack, and so we think it's IT's responsibility. But sometimes IT will say, "Hey, this is connected to an OT network. It's OT's priority." Gets right back to that IT-OT communication and striking that delicate balance of who owns and maintains what, who has the capability and availability to maintain all of this infrastructure, and that's how you're going to meet your data requirement needs. Ultimately, again, this infrastructure here is what serves up your digital transformation. We want to be diligent about designing security into the infrastructure. Another security strategy, I mentioned segmentation. So all of those standards that we showed earlier, they advocate for this concept of separation between enterprise and industrial environments. And this is both physically with hardware and logically with software as well, creating this buffer that we call an industrial demilitarized zone, or IDMZ. The IDMZ's primary function is to eliminate direct traffic between the enterprise systems and critical operation systems. So thinking back to that example of a modern connected warehouse, where we're sending work orders and instructions down into the warehouse, we're pumping data out for data and analytics. Proper segmentation actually means that none of that traffic actually traverses directly from one environment to another. Because thinking back to those attack vectors, that is the number one way that attackers get into an OT environment, is piggybacking, a direct connection from the IT environment. Okay. It is worth noting that when you pursue a true IDMZ or network segmentation project, it is more than just inserting a firewall in front of OT switches or OT equipment. I still see all the time that acting as the band-aided fix, which is IT saying, I've put a firewall in place. Now, true segmentation actually requires separate infrastructure that can operate independent of one another in the event of an attack. It can actually be shut off, and OT can run independently of IT and vice versa. A great example here is actually the Colonial Pipeline attack in 2021. If people remember, there was a rush on fuel in the southeast of the United States because Colonial Pipeline was attacked with ransomware in their enterprise servers. Well, they actually didn't have something like this in place, pure proper segmentation. They weren't impacted in their pipeline. They were just concerned with the fact that an attacker could get into those assets and cause much more harm, releasing oil, whatever it might be. And so they intentionally shut down their operational systems. So whether you actually get attacked in your OT environment or not, it's really important to have these controls in place so that, like that example, you don't take action out of fear of them getting to that environment. Okay. Equally as important to segmentation is having complete visibility into your OT networks. There's this adage that gets thrown around all the time, and I agree with it. You can't protect what you can't see. And that goes for the assets themselves as well as the user management within your environment. And so we'll talk about several tools here. The first that I want to highlight, and this has been growing in popularity recently, is secure remote access solutions specific to OT environments. Now, you might still be using a VPN to accomplish remote access into a plant environment or warehouse environment today. And I'll say it's still a popular option, but VPN solutions can be both time consuming and expensive when you scale that out to a very large number of third parties or a very large number of sites. And so you might actually want to consider opting for an OT purpose tool that allows you to do things like grant access to specific individuals or groups based upon their specific needs. And I'll just build this out here for a second. A model like this takes an on-prem appliance that communicates with your plant assets, and it serves data up into a central console where users access it. And the importance of this is it's a reverse connection, meaning those users don't have actual direct interaction with your network, and you have complete visibility at all times of who's doing what in your network, either in real time or after the fact retroactively. But the biggest benefit here is that you can track and audit that activity. And if you detect unusual behavior for a given session, you can immediately disconnect whatever user is in your system and rewind, step-by-step actions that were taken in your environment. Ultimately, it gives you the control of your network at all times rather than placing that control or responsibility in the hands of a very large vendor community. And that's not to say that vendors intentionally, again, insert exposures and vulnerabilities, but we've seen it happen, absolutely. Okay. So in this example here, we're allowing two different OEMs access to different parts of the warehouse here, and they don't overlap. They can't see each other's equipment. They can only work on the specified equipment that we've given them access to for a certain time frame. Okay. Looking at two more security tools to consider, network-based threat detection, very popular as well, and endpoint detection and response. This gets to the detection piece of the cybersecurity framework. Again, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. This would be detect. When you're looking to detect threats in your OT or ICS environments, you do want OT-specific systems first and foremost that have the requirements of OT and controls in mind. Meaning running things like passive scans on a network and not introducing additional network traffic. I mentioned that example of IT running a vulnerability scan and taking PLCs offline. I still see it all the time. OT purpose-built systems will do this inherently, sitting quietly on a network and understanding traffic activity, such that when you identify anomalous activity, say for example, a PLC talks to a server that it never talks to in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. and sends instruction to someplace in, you name it, right, Saudi Arabia or whatever it might be, that's going to generate a critical alert, and that would trigger your incident response plans and so on and so forth. That's network intrusion detection, and the second would be endpoint detection and response. This is very popular and most commonly used in enterprise systems, but we have seen it move more into the OT environment. And the reason is because they're excellent for detecting threats, both known and unknown. So they take this concept of understanding indicators of compromise, IOCs or IOAs, indicators of attack, and they compare network-based activity, endpoint-based activity to a very large database, and again, help to provide further level of protection. The one thing I will say here is that these are pretty sophisticated systems, so we don't want to do this without careful planning. Okay, and finally, we're seeing this growing adoption of platforms that are specifically tailored to asset and vulnerability management. Whereas we were doing this with multiple platforms in the past, there are specific purpose-built platforms coming out to do this today that help you establish this overall view of risk. You can think of this in a lot of ways as an ongoing live risk assessment, like we talked about in your environment, that gives you security scoring and tracks your progress over time. And so I'll let this build out here. It'll take just a minute, but the ultimate premise here is that we are gathering information as close to the endpoint as possible and residing at that endpoint to acquire information and make better decisions. Again, we talked about one of the fundamental principles being asset visibility 100% across your OT environment if you truly want to know your security posture. And this type of model here really gives you two key benefits. That detailed risk scoring that's not just based on network packets. It's not just based on the National Vulnerability Database, but it's based on deep asset visibility. But also when you reside close to the endpoint, like these systems do, you can actually start to take preventative action like patching, like configuration management. And so it covers more of the NIST spectrum in terms of identify, protection, and detection. And again, continues to increase your security posture. Moving to the final strategy, this is called adaptive, and this is when we start to get closer to best-in-class security. But again, recognizing that these aren't fixed buckets, you can still take aspects of this very early in a security program. This is all about evaluating the investments that you do make today, whether it be in digital initiatives or in security, and making sure that you have that appropriate mix of funding for the long term, right? Multi-year plans, getting buy-in across the organization, change management, adapting that governance model such that there's ownership across your organization, and it doesn't just reside in a handful of individuals to make sure that you're secure across the organization. One of the excellent examples, and I mentioned it earlier, is patch management, ongoing patch management. And I see it all the time. New vulnerabilities are introduced almost on a weekly basis. And something gets announced, and teams have to go scrambling to follow really this process of, do I have that asset? Where does it exist? What needs to be patched? How do I patch it? What's going to be impacted if I do patch it? And so establishing a patch management process up front, in a lot of ways tying that to a modernized infrastructure like we showed, will greatly help you in the face of that incident where, again, someone will see Rockwell controller has a critical vulnerability. What are we doing about it? It's definitely better to be proactive than reactive in this sense. Just a couple more topics here. Documented incident response planning is absolutely critical. I don't save this for later in the discussion because it's an afterthought. It is just a maturity as well to get to a very robust incident response planning and reviewing cadence. But early in your program, I would even say first thing in your program, you want to take a look at what your incident response practices are. Again, I walk into a facility or a warehouse and I see those blue screens. What am I doing? Who am I calling? Who needs to be alerted and who's coming in to support, whether that's in-house or third parties. And so we see a lot of activity in this space as clients start to mature around not only readiness assessments, but tabletop exercises, ongoing annual risk assessments that help you continue to shape, the progress you've made to this point and the progress you still have to go to react to a potential event. When you create an incident response plan, you also want to determine who's going to do the hunting, containment, and eradication of a threat. A lot of times we think about remediation. Who's going to bring my systems back online? And that's, of course, very critical. But one thing we see is that once attacked, you can very likely be attacked again. So you need processes, people in place who can help you eliminate a threat, not just recover from a threat. And that brings us to our final concept here, which is managed security operations, creating this very robust model of ingesting all of your different security alerts into an actionable database, right? So we've just touched on a few technologies here. There's many more to consider, but technologies like a SIEM, it's called a Security Incident and Event Management System, are really excellent platforms for taking not only OT security tooling, but enterprise security tooling and pulling them into a common centralized source for you to make better decisions, because it doesn't help anybody to go into 12 different databases, review 10,000 different alarms and try to make a decision. Contextualizing that down, boiling that down, tuning out, false alerts is really where you start to become real-time preventative for threats. And whether you have an internal security operations center, SOC, or you look for an external third party, that is the goal of what we're trying to get to is be able to understand in near real time, is an incident happening? What do I need to do to get it out of my system? And what do I need to do to recover? Okay, that was a lot. So thank you for the time and attention. As we close our time here, I do want to provide just a few key recommendations from my time interacting with the industry and outline to you what Rockwell has in the form of support to provide complementary services, no matter where you stand on your journey. At this point, you might consider yourself an expert in the NIST cybersecurity framework. If so, great. But whether you came into this event knowing about the framework and having a detailed understanding, or this is the first time you heard about it, hopefully something stuck out to you. And if so, we'd love to continue the discussion after this event and help you through your journey wherever you stand. Every image that you see in this diagram here maps to a capability offering of our cybersecurity professional services. So again, we have deep expertise in helping companies at any point in their security journey. Or maybe you're even more fundamentally at a starting line and just looking for that awareness generation that we talked about and securing buy-in. We'd love to help as well with that. I mentioned the IT/OT security workshops earlier. We're always happy to pull those together just for knowledge sharing and helping the industry out. So please don't hesitate to reach out. This is what our organization looks like from a size and scale perspective. We operate around the world. No matter how large or small your operation is, your organization is, we can support your needs. For us, it really comes down to assessing, designing, implementing, and standing up managed programs that are self-sustaining and ultimately, again, provide that deeper level of security posture. Final note here, I will leave you with 4 key recommendations. That whether it's you, again, that's directly responsible for security, or it's a colleague in your space, feel free to share these Number one, ensure that your IT and OT teams are in active communication and collaboration. If you're able to stand up a dedicated committee and a council that meets on a frequent basis, even better, but make sure that that communication is done in the first place. Number two, review your security plan if you have one. Make sure that it accounts for both IT and OT. If not, use this as the starting point to pull that committee, that council together and start the conversation and start to talk about creating a security roadmap and plan. Third, prioritize your risk based upon any gaps that you identify to that end state that you want to get to and different phases of getting to that end state. And then fourth, as you mature along your journey, hopefully you've done a number of these steps, you've progressed in all aspects of the NIST cybersecurity framework. I highly recommend you guide your partners and your suppliers and your providers along the journey. You pull others with you. Again, regulations don't exist to drive others to account for your security, so it's your responsibility to do that as well. And one mechanism I love is this concept of an ISAC. It's an information sharing group, and they exist for different industries. But you can actually share where you stand in your journey in a safe space with industry peers, and they can share the same. And in that sense, you get a lot of this. What are current trends? What are our peers facing in terms of the threats that they face, and that can help to align your priorities as well. So thank you all very much. Really appreciate it. I think we do have some time here for questions. Dave, I'll give it back to you. And Dave, I think you're muted.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate all the information you shared. I do want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please use the chat window. I don't have any questions at this point, but I do, at least from the audience, but I do have a couple of things, Brian, that might want to ask you to share with the audience.
Sure.
One thing, we hear a lot about AI these days. How is it being used to combat cyber attacks?
Yeah, great question. AI is obviously the hot topic on hand, not only from how does it prevent attacks, but how are attackers using it as well. From the good guys standpoint, the prevention measures, AI is being worked into those tools that I talked about of network intrusion detection, endpoint detection and response, SIM, SOAR, whatever it might be. Security organizations have for a long time, even before it became a buzzword, been leveraging machine learning and analytics to build better data models of threats that exist out there. And there's these concepts of APTs, advanced persistent threats. That's basically tracking individual threat groups and their capabilities and their attack tactics. And when you're able to identify an entity and their motions and their actions, you're able to better understand in your environment what action they're taking. So a lot of the AI comes into tooling in that aspect, but we certainly see that AI is also generating problems in hackers' ability to use it as well.
Great. Okay. Many businesses are using cloud-based applications versus on-premise. Does this make them safer or immune to cyber attacks?
Great question. Yeah, and I'd say it's less a factor of whether you have a cloud-based or on-prem solution, and more what you are preventing, identifying, reacting to, as we mentioned. So in a lot of cases, we cannot leverage cloud solutions to secure OT environments if we're following that proper segmentation model. And this was for years actually the problem with endpoint detection and response. A lot of these are cloud-based solutions. And we were seeing deployments in OT environments, and it was effectively creating a lot of holes in the firewall to allow these connections through, and that again violates principles of proper segmentation. And so ultimately, what we had to do over the years is work towards a model of allowing safe connections through to cloud services, cloud systems. But in a lot of ways, like I mentioned earlier, there's so much data being generated out of these OT systems that you want to reside as closely to those systems as possible, and that's why we still have on-prem systems.
Great. Okay. Since COVID, many businesses have accepted working remote, or at least working in a hybrid environment. Has this introduced new risks for cybersecurity?
Absolutely. This is where the concept of secure remote access has really taken over because, again, before we had very defined remote access requirements into OT environments, and that's absolutely exploded since COVID, and still to this day it continues to proliferate. So certainly when you're considering a remote workforce, whether it's third parties with direct connection into your assets, so OEMs and the like, or it's your own remote workers and employees, you should think about both in the same sense and how you're securing their connection. Not just saying, oh, you've authenticated, through your enterprise laptop, you can get into the OT system. There should be levels of authentication to access, those crown jewels, so to speak.
Great. Okay, as we kind of wrap things up here, what would you say is the most important thing that you want your viewers to take away from your presentation?
Yeah, great question, and thank you again for the time, for having me, for the time and attention. I'd say this topic can come across as daunting, as seeming almost insurmountable at times, and really it's to give hope that there are resources out there to help you make immediate progress, substantial progress as well in your security planning, and whether that's leveraging a security organization like Rockwell Automation or others, or it's just cracking open some of the standards and reading through and understanding some of those best practices. It's about taking a diligent approach, and resources exist out there, both funded and non-funded, to help you along your journey.
Great. Hey, we do have one audience question that I wanted to get in before we wrap up. So, any thoughts on how to overcome the challenges that exist with being able to use a single tool for monitoring? Understanding there is OPC, DA, UA, BAC, NET. That does not necessarily address the ability to communicate and properly monitor. Still hurdles.
Awesome question. Yeah, BACnet, I believe, was the reference there, which is a long-standing OT protocol. Yeah, that is a couple thoughts. This is where the silver bullet approach doesn't quite hold up, right? One system to perfectly monitor all of my security events and alerts. We're going to see gaps and need to fill those gaps with any single tool set. But this is really why we talk about OT purpose-built solutions. These solutions that speak inherently OT protocols, and not just solutions that say, hey, I know network scanning, I know switches, I know how to run a ping sweep, but actually I know how to speak SIP security. I know how to speak Profibus or BACnet or whatever it might be. That's what these OT purpose-built systems are doing. And so I'd say, if you're finding it a challenge to identify the appropriate system based upon the communication protocols that you have in place, definitely follow up with us. We're happy to explore a mix of solutions and what it might take to help secure those.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian. We appreciate all the time and effort in sharing the information today, and certainly your peers from Rockwell Automation. So on behalf of CEDLAC, I want to thank everyone for participating today. Certainly, we can make the presentation available upon request, so we're happy to share a PDF version. And remember, we will be sending out a link to view this session again in the future. So we appreciate, again, your attendance, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.